Hi, everybody. So, week 13, just including week 13, we've got 3 weeks left 13, 14, 15. So, we're almost at the end. So, this week, our topic is political organization and power. It's on the lighter side. It's one of those things where, like in all other chapters, there's a lot of material, and we can't cover it all. So this week I'm focusing mostly on kind of some of the main concepts. You'll see, obviously you can always choose to read the entire chapter if you wish, but these slides, in addition to the concepts that are in the My Daylight quiz, kind of take you through some of the kind of typical points that are covered in this kind of section. The chapter goes more into detail with, some more case studies and some more contemporary examples of differences in power and things like that. And it is very interesting and worthwhile to look at. But again, as usual, there's only so much we can cover, so we're really doing a superficial overview, and you have a you had an assignment that, if you're looking at this after April 19th, you just finished a bigger assignment. So I'm going kind of light on the quantity of concepts that we're talking about this week. So there you go. So, political organization and power, the chapter that goes with it is How Do Anthropologists Study Political Relations, chapter 13. So again, this slide might look familiar by now. It's the third or fourth week in a row that it's been there, and it's just this, weekly reminder that everything we're talking about in this section of the course is all, interwoven. All these topics are interwoven with each other because we're talking about this idea of social organization that includes all these things here. At this point, by the end of this week, we'll have covered everything except social stratification, which is our topic next week, and then you'll see very close links with this week's material. And this week's material, again, is covered, it's connected, and we'll actually refer to that at some point in the slides in terms of like some direct connections with economic systems, in terms of the work people do, access to resources, things like that. So yeah, let's jump right into it. So what are we talking about when we say political organization? We're talking about the organization of power in a society, and so things like leadership, right? Who's a leader? And we'll see later that leadership isn't always what people growing up in the West think it is. Decision making, so who makes decision, who's involved, who has a voice. Conflict resolution, because in any society conflicts happen, or between societies, and how what mechanisms are there to deal with these conflicts. Social control. Every society in the world has norms, values that people try to live by or encouraged to live by, ways that people are expected to behave, and these are different from culture to culture, from society to society. And we've seen, back when we started talking about culture, we said, not everybody in a society or who shares a culture, they don't all agree with each other, but there are some common things and all this stuff, right? So, there are ways that a society sets itself up to try to make sure that people mostly follow the norms. Okay, so essentially what anthropologists emphasize is that when we say political, it's not just about Western style political structures, the governments that those of us growing up in these systems are used to. So you might remember that I kind of said this several times back when we were talking, for example, about economic systems, and how in anthropology, when we talk about economic anthropology or economic structures or economic organization in anthropology, we're not just hyper-focusing on the capitalist, market economy, with currency and all that. We're looking at different ways that societies throughout time, and some even today, sometimes even parallel to that capitalist market economy, have maintained other ways of engaging in economic exchange, either through reciprocity, things like that. And so it's similar with political organization. If you've grown up in a place, as I think most of us have, where the political structure that's in place is, some kind of government with a hierarchy and some people making decisions pretty much for everybody else, and that's just what it is. It might seem that that's kind of a natural way of doing things, and people are left sometimes with these stereotypes that since the beginning of time, as a lot of you like to start your essays, there have there's always had, every society in the world has had a boss, a chief, someone in charge, and that's reemphasized in stereotypes about indigenous peoples in the movie. Sometimes they're very portrayed in very stereotypical ways that make them seem very primitive compared to Westerners, and that's unfortunate because first of all, there's a lot of knowledge in indigenous societies around the world. And they're no less advanced than anybody else. It's just people have adapted to their different environments in different ways and makes sense in those environments. And a lot of there are different indigenous cultures around the world. They're not all the same, and so some of them have had some kind of hierarchical systems and some don't. Some are more egalitarian, and we'll see some of that. So again, it's one of those tricky words because you hear political, you think of Parliament Hill and mayors and prime ministers, or you think of the states with the problematic stuff that's been, well, got problematic stuff here too, but we know the big T was a big thing up until last November, and we kind of look at that and that's what we think, all politics, right? It's right? But no, it's more than that. Obviously all that is a part of it because these are cultural things too, but there are other ways of doing things. So we said, just in the previous slide here, organization of power in a society. Well, what is power? So the textbook goes into that a little bit. And power, sometimes we think power is all about, say, physical force, things like that. The textbook authors describe power in an interesting way. They essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's like the ability to affect a situation or change a situation, involving other people, right? So it's kind of, it can look a lot of different ways. And the textbook cites Eric Wolf, an anthropologist, who talked about 3 modes of power. And so that kind of divides it up a little bit so that you can think about power in a more complex and nuanced way. So Wolf talked about interpersonal power, which is, the kind of thing where one person kind of can exercise control over other people, or at least influence them or exert their will, right? And sometimes that happens, and with all this, it's not here in the slides and they don't really talk about it in the book, but this can be all of, well, especially interpersonal power can be formal sometimes, where a person is actually given authority, and that kind of comes and fits into these other things. But for the most part, when you're talking about interpersonal power just at the generic level, it can be pretty informal. And I think that all of us have been, for example, in a social circle, maybe a group of friends that always hangs out. It could have been high school, even elementary school. Now most of us aren't hanging out with anybody in CJAB before this happened, and very often there's an individual who winds up always having their way, and they have a lot of influence, and nobody gave them that power necessarily directly and said, hey, you're the boss of this group, but it can just be kind of these interpersonal dynamics that emerge. And and that can be a question of personality and cultural context, because different personality traits are prized in any culture, right? They're not the same in every culture, but every culture has its certain characteristics that it will encourage more than others. And in the West, very much like this kind of assertiveness, extreme assertiveness, aggressiveness, for a long time has been encouraged, especially among men, right? But and that maybe is kind of changing, but that's kind of one of the factors sometimes in these kinds of things. But interpersonal power is very much about individuals exercising their will over others somehow. Organizational power is more specific to contexts in which you'll have either an individual or a group of people who can exercise their will or control other people. And here we might be thinking of, say, a boss in a company, or any kind of thing like that. And structural power is really at the broader social level. So we're really talking about an entire system here where everything is set up in such a way that a population can be controlled. And this all sounds very dire, right? It might, sound like, I don't know if any of you have read the classic 1984, maybe in a class in high school or at Vanier in an English class or something. People like to talk about that when they think about, oh my God, censorship, or, or things about people's rights being restricted. And it sounds very dire, but you know what? The society we live in, we are being controlled essentially through laws. Our movements are, right now, they're extremely well, I wouldn't say extremely. It could be a lot worse. Ontario has almost a full lockdown where they can't leave their house without a good reason. We can still circulate pretty freely before 8 o'clock at night, right? Right now. And just in case I reuse this video in the future, you never know, it's April 2021. So if we're still in lockdown in 2025, maybe I'll reuse this video. I don't know. But yeah, it's really, any society has some kind of structures in place, and we'll see that it's not always super formal with laws and actual regulations. It can be informal, but there is some kind of way to kind of try to control the actions of people in a culture. And it's not always a case of like control for the sake of control. It's to try to maintain some kind of social harmony sometimes, and other times, yeah, it is for the sake of control, or So forms of political organization. So this textbook is interesting because in a classic anthropology intro textbook, almost the entire chapter is devoted to these next couple of slides that I'm about to talk about. And in this textbook, they only use a few pages out of a much larger chapter. So what I'm about to talk about here is kind of some of this classic anthropology, and they do kind of frame it that way in terms of, the authors of this textbook do this a lot, where they kind of take you through changes in thought in anthropology over time, and it's good to be aware of that, especially if you're planning to go into anthropology or any other social science, because you see the trends over time in any discipline kind of often reflect what's going on in the broader society. So here I'm being meta, I'm being anthropological about anthropology, like woo! Yeah, I'm as tired as you are. So forms of political organization, it's like kind of, we're looking at ways that different cultures around the world over time have organized themselves in the ways that we just discussed, in order to kind of maintain some kind of social order, and resolve conflicts and make decisions, and so on and so forth. So through ethnographic work and looking at societies around the world, anthropologists kind of came up with categories, kind of like we did with subsistence strategies, where you had foragers. Well, you had these two broad categories: food collectors versus food producers, not versus as in they're against each other, but just to differentiate them. And then in food collectors, you had you have hunting, you have some forms of fishing, gathering wild plants, and then in food producing, you have animal herding, cultivating crops, either through small-scale farming or large-scale agriculture, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are societies that are going to fall between the cracks, or maybe do more than one of those things. It's the same thing here with these forms of political organization. So they're broad categories, and there can be kind of different ways of doing things even within those categories, but they kind of give you an idea. So they're obviously related. Again, I said this in the first slide, but I think it's really important to reiterate that, because you know how excited I get about that holistic perspective, right? So they're related. I mean, these forms of political organization are very closely related to, say, subsistence, which I just talked about, economic systems like reciprocity and redistribution, ideas about gender and sexuality, family and marriage, and so on and so forth. Okay? So in the slides that follow, I'll be talking about the 4 classic forms of political organization that anthropologists have been kind of talking about for decades, and can be helpful to a certain extent in looking at exactly what we're just saying here in terms of how things are connected with each other within a culture. with the understanding again that some societies might blend things, and cultures have changed over time, and sometimes there's outside influence because of colonialism and imperialism, things like that. And now this textbook actually adds a fifth one. They also talk about empires as a form of political organization. So you can read all about these on pages 296 to 299. Like, are these the four classic ones plus the fifth one that they included as a form of political organization. And here we're just going to kind of talk, and again, it's just like kind of useful to help understand the holistic perspective a little bit more. So classically, and this is a bit different than how they frame it in the book, I do find this helpful to help students kind of understand the difference between some of these forms of political organization. So classically, the four main types are split into two broader categories of uncentralized and centralized. And this, I think, is really interesting to know, again, to kind of consider that idea that not everything is about, governments and things like that, right? So societies that have an uncentralized political organization, and we're going to see there are two types of those, they tend to be more egalitarian. And when we talk about it, we'll talk more about egalitarianism when we talk about stratification next week, because egalitarianism is an absence of stratification, essentially, whereas stratification is you have these layers of people, some of whom have more access to food and the necessities of life and power and privilege and all those things than others, right? Basically kind of some kind of ranking or hierarchy. Egalitarian societies don't have that. They tend to have small populations. Usually there doesn't tend to be a chief or a fixed government in place, and if there is, it's kind of temporary, maybe for a specific situation, because that person is seen as skilled in that area, and so people are going to let that person lead this specific event or thing that's going on. These societies tend to be organized by kinship. So last week when we talked about family and marriage and all that, and part of that discussion was about, say, lineages and clans and how people are organized in some societies into these descent groups. Well, here's one holistic link, is that those can be very political in the sense that these entities, these descent groups where people are linked through ancestry, over time, they sometimes will be also be political entities in terms of how they interact and deal with other lineages. So when we talk about exogamy, for example, where you're expected to marry somebody outside your lineage or clan, it helps maintain those good political relations, such, or economic relations like trade, political alliance, like, so if people are attacked, they know who their allies are, things like that. So these small societies that tend to be egalitarian, often they're organized by kinship and kind of along these kinds of lines. So any leadership that does exist, again, it's informal. So what that means is that there are people in any society that other people will turn to for guidance, and whose word maybe will have more authority, but not authority as in that person is the boss and can tell other people what to do. In these societies, if you're a leader, it doesn't mean you get to tell people what to do. It just means that people will respect your vision, maybe, and your words more than those of others. Usually you'll have earned this in a social way through showing that you're wise, that you make good decisions, that you care about your people, that you're accountable to them. And the minute if you start messing up a lot, and then you start disrespecting people will just stop following you and find somebody else. So it's not formal leadership in the sense that you're elected and then you're the boss for a few years and you get to do almost anything you want. Okay? So there's no direct power to enforce norms. You can have an influence, maybe people will tend to listen to you more, but you can't kind of say, hey, stop that. Or, well, you can try, but it doesn't mean people don't have to listen to you. So there's more reliance here on informal modes of social control. And what that means, again, when we talk about formal versus informal, in these small societies, you don't necessarily need all these laws that are written down. It's more norms that people have and that people teach to every generation. And of course, like anywhere else, people are going to disagree. And then they wind up working things out in other ways than, say, arresting people and putting them in jail or having court systems. Or so there could be some kind of thing where people get together to make decisions, especially in extreme cases, like when you're talking about very violent things like rape or murder or some kinds of theft. But if it's just like kind of little chicanes, little conflicts, people resolve them informally. Sometimes by, again, some of these societies are people who they spend part of the year circulating throughout a territory in smaller groups. So, if two people get along, they can just part ways and maybe go spend time with a different, people are related in all kinds of different ways. You can travel with, like, I don't know, your brother's family or something for a while and get away from that annoying person or, things like that. So it's very at the informal level, kind of like it is in our daily lives in a lot of way, because at the family level and the friendship level, our relations aren't kind of overtly governed by these wider laws, right? So in these societies, things have been kind of at that level, but at society wide, because you have populations typically of, you don't have thousands and thousands of people in these populations. You start to see centralized forms of political organization when, oh, sorry, I forgot a point here on the other side. So people have more freedom and flexibility in these smaller, uncentralized systems. So and uncentralized, I didn't actually address that word, right? But uncentralized means that you don't have this centralized power. When we look at the kinds of governments that a lot of us are used to, say just Canada, there's centralized power in the sense that you have a federal government that is kind of in charge of the whole country, and then each province also has, so they're centralized at different levels. You have the federal level, you have the provincial level, you have the municipal level, but these are all centers of power. The US is the same thing, right? So each town has its center of power, each state, each in the whole country has a center of power, right? So we'll talk about nation states, but that's pretty much how they work. So centralized political systems tend to go along with larger populations, because you get to a larger population, it's harder to maintain this sense of egalitarianism and this informal way of doing things. You have a larger population. So there's a move here away from kin-based networks, okay, and things start to be kind of less family-oriented. Some individuals or groups wind up gaining more control. Okay, so you start to see the emergence also of the division of labor within the population, and this comes back to what we talked about in terms of those different economic systems, and even back when we talked about archaeology and we saw evidence of more hierarchy, when you start to have more, settled societies that are growing crops and starting to store things, with some people storing more than others, and then different kinds of work, with some people being stuck doing the grunt work while other people have more free time to explore the arts or just figure out how to control other people more. Sorry, I'm a bit jaded about humanity sometimes. So, you start to see that develop, and then you start to have this kind of institutional power and authority that is centralized, right? And sometimes there's a use of coercion or force to get people to go along with what those leaders want to do. So different systems, so two broad categories of ways of doing things, and they kind of, when you look at it, it's very hard to maintain all those things that go along with an uncentralized egalitarian system when you start to get these larger populations. So, which is not an excuse to justify the oppression that happens in a lot of these centralized systems, especially when we get to this state level, but it's an explanation of how that wound up emerging. And again, I really discard, I know this is something that you learn in the movies and everywhere else, common stereotypes, that somehow evolution led from some of these, kind of small primitive bands to now these more evolved state societies. It's not like that, because you have egalitarian bands that have existed until very recently, and the only reason that there's a lot less of them now is because of colonization, kind of, and the assimilation pressure that goes with that. So it has been an adaptive way of life for many groups around the planet. But then when your land base gets interfered with, it's hard to maintain that. So each of these broad categories can then be subdivided into two. So anthropologists have classically talked about bands and tribes. And the word band isn't, like a rock band here. We're talking about like a band type society where, I'm not going to go over all of this, but it just gives you an idea, and the textbook gives you some info too. But again, this is kind of at the smallest level. Usually we're talking about people who are foraging. They don't necessarily need a very boxed in form of organization, because there's fluidity about who you're going to be, say, traveling with throughout the winter and camping with and hunting with. And basically all adults in this kind of society have a voice in decisions that involve a community, because they're very small. They can do that, right? And tribes are not much bigger than bands. I mean, it's like a tribe in the classic anthropological sense, not in the way that people use it in their everyday lives, but in the classic anthropological sense, a tribe is basically, you can think of it as a bunch of bands that sometimes come together. So tribes, you have like smaller groups that are kind of autonomous and still based in kin networks. And who like bands, they share common ancestry, culture, language, and all this stuff. And these smaller groups are autonomous, but then they'll get together as a larger tribe when necessary, maybe if there's an external threat, or for trade, or different things like that. And in those kinds of situations, maybe that they might have temporary leadership that again is informal, but they say there's there's a conflict with an external group, we need somebody who has certain characteristics to be able to deal with this, but then once that crisis is over with, then things go back to normal. Okay. So then when you get into centralized political systems, then anthropologists have typically spoken of chiefdoms and states. And what a chiefdom is that, again, you're still kind of very kin-based, so these kinds of societies aren't as big as the state level, all right, but they're bigger than bands and tribes. And so they're still very much based in kins, but you start to see more of a fixed hierarchy, and people are ranked. Okay, so leadership will be in this. Chiefdom is named after this idea that you have like a chief, and sometimes this is a hereditary position. Now this again can be confusing, because you'll have, for example, peoples here who will talk about chief. Chief is another one of these words where anthropologists use it in this context, but people in their daily lives might use it differently. And for example, you have indigenous peoples who will use this term even to refer to an informal leader, if they're more of a band type society traditionally, but it's just an English word to them that they learned, and it doesn't necessarily, just like a bunch of other words that like political or economic, the way people use it, it doesn't necessarily the same as how anthropologists use it. So I know it's confusing. And it's an unfortunate side effect of how anthropologists categorize things sometimes. And so here, the rank that you have is based, and the prestige that you have in your society is based on how close you are to that chief, essentially, right? So there's a kind of chain of command there. And so the chief here, and people who are close to the chief, will tend to have control over economic activities, and often these are kind of larger scale agricultural societies. So you're seeing this shift also, right, that also goes with the kind of subsistence that people engage in. And then when you get to the level of states, which is the other kind of centralized political system, that's the one that a lot of us have grown up in, a state. And again, we're not talking about like a state like in the US, like New York State or New Jersey or something like that. A state is a kind of political structure where you have a complex kind of multi-tiered society that is associated with a defined territory. So you look at a globe or a world map, all those borders that are there, they weren't created by people, and that they weren't always there, right? And they've changed over the centuries since states have emerged, and but they have a defined territory, and you see very heavy stratification here. And stratification is our next topic next week. So you have layers of people, essentially, some with more power than others. And these states are managed and defended by governments through military force. And this is different from nation. We'll talk about that in a different slide, so I'm not going to go too much into it here. Oops, there we are. So just to kind of wrap up this part here, so we're coming back to, again, you have these uncentralized systems and these centralized systems, and that's a classic way of splitting things up. Doesn't mean every society in the world fits neatly into these categories, but it kind of helps anthropologists kind of see some of those holistic connections with other aspects of social organization, like kinship, like economic systems. So just to clarify that whole state versus nation and nation state thing, in everyday language, people tend to use nation and country interchangeably, for example. So a country, like you have the country, the countryside, whatever. It's sometimes used in a vague way, but a country, when people talk about the country of Canada or the United States or Uganda or Vietnam or China or Russia or Australia, or, these are countries. They're also nation states. Okay, so country is often used in that sense of nation state. Nation actually means something slightly different, but again, in our everyday speech, people tend to use nation in the same way that they would use country. So that's why some people in Canada, for example, get very riled up when some Francophone Quebecers refer to themselves as a nation, because it's like, no, you're not, you're still a part of Canada. Well, anthropologically and sociologically, yeah, it's a nation, okay? And we're going to see why. We can also think of First Nations, right? Some groups of indigenous peoples in Canada, for example, who refer to themselves as First Nations. So nation, so anthropologically and sociologically, what nation means is a group of people with a sense of shared history, culture, identity, and even ancestry. Okay, so yeah, when you hear some people and some francophones in Quebec refer to themselves as a nation, that's why. Okay, same thing with First Nations. Nation state is a political entity that is attached to a territory. Okay, so Canada, France, okay, places like that. Now there's overlap, there's a connection between these two things. The distinction can be subtle because often nation states they were largely built on these senses of national identity that wound up emerging over time, particularly, say before colonization of where we live now, Turtle Island. Say, even if you think back to, say, European history, you started having these senses of national identity. Benedict Anderson wrote a fantastic book. It's a little bit old, but it's very illuminating if you want to understand that process of the emergence of nation states and senses of national identity and how it's linked to the invention of printing. I really recommend that anybody going into any social science read that book. It was a game changer for me when I was a student. So the creation of nation states benefited from this idea that some people were being brought in together, sometimes over wider territories where people previously kind of just did their own thing and didn't really have much to do with each other. But at some point, especially with the printing press and then being able to distribute writings on a very wide level, you're getting people to feel this sense of commonality, and as though they emerged from some common ancestry. It could be hundreds or thousands of years before. And so nation states eventually emerged from that, where it's like, okay, all of a sudden we have this border, and everybody inside this border is part of the same nation and has a shared identity and language and culture. Which sometimes we tend to think that way, but if you've traveled at all, you might know that when you get to border areas, sometimes there's things that are, people on two sides of a border might be more similar to each other culturally and linguistically than people elsewhere in their nation state. So if you go close to the border of France and Germany, for example, you'll have these little border towns where things are a little bit different than they are elsewhere in France or elsewhere in Germany. Even locally, if any of you have grown up in the Eastern Townships, I spent part of my youth there, and sometimes we'd go down to, say, Vermont, and those border towns between, on Quebec on one side and Vermont on the other, there were similarities just in terms of the vibe of the place, right? So all that said, that's why Benedict Anderson has referred to his title of his book is Imagined Communities, and the textbook talks about this as well. This is very relevant to this discussion. So here's the thing then, because of these definitions, you can have more than one nation within a nation state, right? So again, with the Canadian example, if you have some French Quebecers who identify as a nation within this broader nation state, some of them want to be a separate nation state, that's a whole other story, right? But even if right now they're not a separate nation state, we can legitimately, in a anthropology and sociology, refer to that as a nation. You also have many First Nations, right? Hundreds of indigenous groups who, would fall under the category of First Nations and who identify as nations. And then there are nations that kind of can straddle borders that have been created by nation states. So, for example, the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, more commonly known as the Mohawk, their traditional homelands were, kind of go across what is that border between Canada and the U.S. that is now there, and even the Quebec and Ontario border, right? So their homelands were there, and then some people came and created these nation states and with borders that cut through their traditional lands. So that's, there's connections between the concepts of nation and nation state, but they're not the same. Okay, so nation state is a kind of state like we saw here in this previous slide, one of these centralized political systems. Okay, so some important points to retain. We're almost at the end here. Some important points to retain from this discussion is that political organization is adapted to other cultural aspects, and those other cultural aspects are adapted to political organization. Again, when we talk about holism, it's because everything within a culture is linked together, and it doesn't mean it's static and never changes, okay? But then if some things change, then other things have to change as well, because they're kind of connected in this giant web. And it also helps us understand cultural relativism, because if in your mind, if you've always grown up in a place where there was centralized leadership and you've grown to think that this is the only way a society can function, then when you hear about a society where they don't have formal leaders, they do everything informally, you're going to think, oh my god, that must be so chaotic, and you're going to have this ethnocentric reaction. But then if you take the time to learn and go, oh, okay, I'll learn more about this culture, and then you see that it makes sense in that context because of all these other things, and then you're being culturally relative. And it doesn't mean you have to move there and start living that way, but it does mean that you can understand why, these other systems that might be new to you make sense in some contexts. Population size is relevant. So as we saw, when we kind of look at those differences between uncentralized and centralized systems, societies that have had uncentralized systems tended to be significantly smaller in population than the centralized one. It's not the only factor, right? Because a population that might be kind of growing at some point, they can decide to kind of wind up switching how they do things, or they can just say, oh hey, we should kind of maybe try to limit that population a little bit more. And so people, again, that concept of agency that comes back in our textbook is relevant here as well. So, as I mentioned this before, things like decision by consensus, maintaining relations of reciprocity, these things are easier to maintain in a smaller society. Usually when we're in person, I love to do this exercise, and I've had so much fun with this exercise over the years, where I'll get, we'll be in class, and I'll say, okay, so pair up and pretend that you have to decide where you're going to go to lunch today, or dinner if the class is in the afternoon, whatever. Your next meal. And then, usually, and I say, raise your hand when you're done. And usually within a minute or two, all the pairs have raised their hands. It doesn't take very long. I'm like, okay. Then I take a couple of, I group them in bigger groups. I'll take, say, 2 pairs and put them together, so you have, groups of 4. And okay, now decide. And then, sometimes it'll take not too much longer than it did the first time. Sometimes because of those interpersonal dynamics where you'll have one individual who's just very assertive and the others just kind of go along with it, right? And then I just keep going like this to a bigger and bigger group again, until ultimately the whole class has to decide. And it's so interesting to observe how people handle this. And so obviously people wind up figuring it out, that the point of the exercise is that, yeah, when you're just two people, it's kind of easy to kind of make a decision and come to a consensus most of the time, not always, right? And the bigger the group gets, the more difficult it is. And, you know, I've had incidents where sometimes if I was just feeling like I was having too much fun, I would let it go on for 10, 15, 20 minutes just to see what people would do. Some people said, okay, we're going to vote. And then other times people are just continuously trying to charm people to go along with their idea, or people decide to split up, or some people have gotten very upset too. It's very entertaining, for me anyways. And then you have the people who sit back passively and don't say anything. That's usually the majority. So it's a reflection of wider society dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier, leadership doesn't always involve power and authority. Like in centralized systems, power is very much involved in direct authority. But in smaller societies and in these uncentralized systems, you don't need that. And in fact, people would revolt against that a lot of times. It would be like, who do you think you are telling everybody else what to do? You know? So there are mechanisms in place, leveling mechanisms, that where people, it's built into the social structure to keep people kind of from getting too big of an ego and starting to hoard power and things because they want to maintain an egalitarian system. So last slide. So all that said, there's a big chunk of the textbook chapter devoted to thinking of, domination. So we see in the world there are societies where there's, a small group that dominates a wider group. You also have some nation states, I should say, I caught myself there, that dominate others. They even talk about empires, right? A nation state taking over others, right? So relations of domination, and it's easy to think that domination always happens through the use of coercion. The textbook talks about coercion a lot, force. Coercion can be through words, threats, just even overt force, military force, right? So sometimes we tend to think that it's always the way it happens. Now it can. It absolutely does happen, and it has happened, but it doesn't always have to be that way. Scholars who've observed history and cross-cultural ways in which these things happened have observed that long-term domination tends to be achieved by getting a population to accept the legitimacy of the rule in place through transmission of worldviews and ideologies, through the educational system, through media, and so forth. So I would argue, for example, that our current system, which a lot of us grow up to be taught that this is a fair way of doing things, this is the only fair way to do things, this is the most equitable way to do things, and then when you start to dig and you see all the social inequalities right here in Canada, in Quebec, in Montreal, where you have people essentially dying in the streets of poverty, or malnutrition, and some people have more access to education and work and health and apartments than others. Well, maybe the system isn't as fair as we've been led to think it is. But again, in the West, through our educational system, through the media, there's this idea transmitted that this is the ultimate way to be. Everybody should want to be like this. So anthropologically, we can see that, well, maybe this isn't the ultimate way to be. It's certainly not the only way to be. It doesn't have to be this way. It might have seemed to be a good idea at the time, but look at where we're at now. Also look at the domination of, for example, what are commonly called first world countries like the USA and Canada, and how they built their nations by colonizing and displacing and even murdering indigenous peoples and other people who were brought by force, for example, from the African continent to be enslaved, and also now kind of through imperialism and multinational corporations exploiting people in other countries, so in South American countries and in African countries and Asian countries. And so, that's if you grow up thinking, well, this is just how it is, and you don't question it, then you are kind of accepting the legitimacy of that form of domination. And that lasts a very long time, and it's hard to get people to think critically about a system that has been fed to them as the only legitimate fair way to do things, and feeding you stereotypes about how primitive people do things and how that's somehow more barbaric, when really no. So that's kind of, again, there's so much more to this topic in this chapter, but we'll leave it there. Just to kind of give you, again, it's an overview, it's a tip of the iceberg course, so we're just scratching the surface, and always open to questions about any of these things. And if you are keen to know more and you have the time, read the whole chapter, and you'll get a lot out of it.